The Sicilian defense is powerful, but it can be crushed with fast development and control of the center and quickly mobilize your pieces for attack. Don't let black build counterplay. Strike first, keep pressure, and the game is yours. So we are talking about this position. After white's first move pawn to e4, black responds with pawn to c5, entering the Sicilian defense. Now you play knight to f3, which is the main move here, one of the most popular responses. Most likely, your opponent will continue with pawn to d6, a move that may lead to the dragon variation or the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, famously played by Fischer, Kasparov, and many others. Therefore, you will see this move from black very often. At this point, you respond with pawn to c3, which is known as the delayed alipin, and you would be surprised to see how powerful this seemingly simple move can be. Now, what is the point of it? The idea is pretty clear. You are preparing to push pawn to d4, establishing a strong pawn center with pawns on e4 and d4. That is the most obvious purpose of pawn to c3. But here's what makes this opening really underrated. There are so many traps and pitfalls for black along the way that it is truly mind-boggling. You probably would not expect this opening to be dangerous or aggressive for white, but it actually is. For example, imagine you are playing black. How would you continue? Most players will naturally consider moves like knight to c6 or knight to f6, which are standard developing moves in the Sicilian defense. And generally speaking, every chess book teaches, develop knights before bishops in the opening. However, in this particular position, the move knight to c6 is almost a losing mistake. Perhaps it is too early to say black is completely lost after this move, but after white plays pawn to d4, black's position becomes very difficult, dangerously close to losing already. Now, what is the point here? Let's say black decides to trade in the center. White now threatens to push pawn to d5, attacking the black knight. The knight would have to retreat, and white also gains strong space control, making it much harder for black to defend. On top of that, white's bishop may come to b5 in the future, adding even more pressure. In short, white gets a very comfortable advantage, and black will already be in serious trouble. Black might try another idea with bishop to g4, saying, I do not need to defend directly. I will pin your knight instead and put pressure on the pawn at d4. At first, it may seem like white has to play a defensive move, but instead, white boldly pushes pawn to d5 anyway. Now, moving the knight backwards would be very passive and unattractive, so most opponents will try knight to e5, placing the knight in the center. At this point, black is probably expecting white to calmly defend with bishop to e2, but instead white shocks them with a sacrifice. Knight takes e5. Black is forced to accept, so bishop takes d1. And now comes the key winning move, bishop to b5 check. Suddenly, black has no good defense. The only way to cover the king is by giving back the queen. After that, white continues with bishop takes d7 check, the king moves, and white is already up material, clearly winning the game. At this point, practically any move for white is winning. You can simply keep capturing. Knight takes f7, then king takes, and on the very next move you capture on h8. This leaves you ahead by a rook and a minor piece, an overwhelming advantage. You can clearly see how this sharp line turns into a beast of a combination, completely crushing black in just a few moves, even though black seemed to play natural developing moves. Now, let's look a little deeper at the other possible moves black might use against you, so that you know how to respond. For example, after knight to f3, black is not forced to play pawn to d6. Another very common move is knight to c6. So, does this mean you now have to memorize long and complicated lines of opening theory? Not at all. Instead, you can shock your opponent with a surprising gambit pawn to b4. This move is very rare, but also extremely powerful in practice. I have won countless games with it, especially in blitz. It is definitely an excellent weapon for white. Once we have excluded that option, let's return to the main move, pawn to d6. Now we play pawn to c3, which is known as the delayed alipin. A common question you may have is, why play the delayed alipin if you can play the regular alipin immediately? The standard alipin, of course, begins with pawn to c3, preparing pawn to d4 in various types of Sicilian positions. And logically, you might think, playing something with a delay should be worse than playing it right away. But in this case, that is not true. Let's look at why. If you play the immediate alipin, black has strong ways to challenge you in the center right away. They can attack your pawn on e4 by playing pawn to d5, which is quite strong, or by playing knight to f6. Either way, black is putting direct pressure on your central pawn and can often equalize comfortably. Now, what happens when you start with knight to f3, and only after pawn to d6 do you play pawn to c3? This move order helps you avoid those problems. By inserting knight to f3 first, you prevent two of black's strongest replies against the alipin. Black no longer wants to play pawn to d5 because they just committed to pawn to d6 on the previous move. At this point, it is almost a mistake for black to play pawn to d5 because it loses a tempo. If black plays knight to f6, which is the move they are most likely to choose, trying to attack your central pawn on a 4, there is a really elegant solution for white. Simply ignore it and play bishop to e2. If black is tempted by the pawn and captures it, then queen to a4 creates a double attack on the opponent's king and knight, winning material immediately. This is one of the reasons why the delayed alipin can lead to a very quick win. Now, let's say black is careful and does not take the pawn. What would they do next? According to statistics, the most common move in this position is knight to c6. At first glance, it looks like a completely natural, standard developing move, the kind you would play in almost any opening. However, in this particular position, knight to c6 is actually almost a losing mistake. It is not obvious at all. In fact, even a grandmaster might not notice it without deep analysis. I know it now after studying this opening extensively, but prior to that, I would never have guessed that knight to c6 could be so problematic. As a quick spoiler, in this position, it would be much better for black to play another move instead of knight to c6, and in that case, they could reach a normal, solid game. The good news for you is that with the delayed alipin, you have not compromised your position at all. You have no weaknesses, and everything is perfectly fine for white. If black plays almost any move other than knight to c6, then the game simply continues as a normal chess game. You will continue defending your pawn on e4 and eventually push pawn to d4, maintaining a solid position. Everything is standard, and you have a comfortable game. However, if black plays knight to c6, the most natural and standard developing move, you respond with pawn to d4 anyway. This again tempts black into capturing the central pawn on a 4, which can lead to another blunder. For example, if black takes the pawn immediately, or after an exchange on d4, then you can play pawn to d5, attacking the knight. If black moves the knight to almost any square, such as knight to a 5, white has the powerful double attack queen to a 4, targeting both the king and the knight. This is a hidden tactical idea that many opponents will overlook. If black does not fall into the trap and plays carefully, the only move that saves them is queen to a 5 check, a counterattack. This at least avoids immediate disaster, but white can continue with knight to c3. After a potential exchange on c3, black still has a final chance to make a serious mistake, capturing the pawn on c3 with a check. At first, this looks strong, but after bishop to d2, white attacks the queen, and the knight on c6 remains under attack, leaving black in a losing position. On the next move, you can capture one of black's pieces, winning the game. The fun part about the delayed alipin is that traps are everywhere. At almost every step, black has a real chance to blunder. Now let's say your opponent is more experienced and plays knight to a 5. That's fine. You can trade on e5 to damage black's pawn structure. Then you can castle. The resulting position is still excellent for white. You have strong attacking chances because most of black's pieces are undeveloped, their king is stuck in the center, and it will take time for them to finish development or castle. Meanwhile, black struggles to play moves like pawn to a 6 or develop their bishop naturally. White also benefits from open lines and diagonals. The long diagonal and the b-file are ready for your rooks and bishops, giving you multiple attacking ideas. In a practical game, black is under serious pressure, and it's extremely difficult for them to save this position. White is close to winning early in the opening or early middle game. Thanks for watching.